There's a strange law in human psychology. The less available something becomes, the more valuable it can appear. You see this everywhere, in relationships, social status, business, even in the way people think about opportunities. When something is constantly available, the mind adjusts to it. Familiarity reduces its emotional impact. But when access suddenly disappears, something changes inside us. We begin to notice what we previously ignored. You don't necessarily stop appreciating them consciously, your mind simply stops treating their attention as something scarce. Then one day, they pull away. Suddenly you notice. You wonder why they haven't replied. You replay previous conversations. You examine their behavior. You ask yourself whether you said something wrong. The very attention you once received without thinking has now become something you want to recover. This is the psychology of scarcity. We tend to assign greater value to things that appear limited, difficult to obtain, or at risk of disappearing. But there is something deeper happening here. When another person withdraws their attention, they create an information gap. You no longer know exactly where you stand with them, and the human mind dislikes unfinished stories. It wants an explanation, it wants closure, and this is where the chase begins. You may tell yourself, I just want to know what happened, but underneath that, curiosity can be something much stronger, the desire to restore what has been taken away. You are no longer simply pursuing the person, you are pursuing the feeling of being wanted by that person again. This is why chasing can become so irrational. The more distant someone becomes, something can become desirable simply because it is unavailable. That is an important distinction. We can confuse difficulty with worth. We can mistake emotional tension for attraction and uncertainty for depth. This is one of the oldest traps in human behavior. We assume that if we have to work harder to obtain something, it must be more valuable. Sometimes it is. Sometimes we are simply responding to the obstacle. The wise person learns to recognize the difference. But if someone deliberately ignores you simply to provoke anxiety and make you chase them, you are no longer dealing with scarcity, you are dealing with manipulation. And this distinction becomes essential as we move deeper into the psychology of attraction. The real power does not come from learning how to make people desperate for your attention, it comes from understanding why you become desperate for theirs. So when someone suddenly becomes unavailable, don't immediately chase. Pause, observe your own reaction, ask yourself, do I truly value this person, or has their absence simply made me afraid of losing them? Because sometimes, the moment you stop chasing what is running away, you finally discover what was actually worth pursuing. Asterisk. Never confuse scarcity with value. Learn to recognize the difference. And this brings us to something even more powerful: uncertainty. If scarcity makes something appear valuable, uncertainty can make it consume your attention. Think about the difference between someone telling you clearly, I don't want a relationship with you, and someone who gives you mixed signals. The first may hurt, but it gives your mind an answer. The second can keep you awake at night. You begin analyzing every message, every silence, and the more you try to solve the mystery, the more emotionally invested you become. This happens because the human mind has a deep need to complete unfinished patterns. We want clarity, we want to know where we stand. When information is missing, we instinctively try to fill the gap. And if emotions are involved, imagination often fills that gap with possibilities. Maybe they still care. Maybe they're testing me. Maybe they're afraid of getting close. Maybe they will come back. Notice what has happened. The person has done less, yet you are thinking about them more. They become obsessed because they don't know what the person will give them next. And this is why unpredictable attention can be so psychologically powerful. When attention is consistent, the mind adapts. But when it appears unexpectedly, a message after days of silence, a sudden compliment, an unexpected invitation, the emotional impact can feel much stronger. You begin waiting for the next moment. This can create a dangerous cycle. Distance creates anxiety, anxiety creates pursuit. Pursuit sometimes produces a small amount of attention. That attention creates relief. Then the person withdraws again, and the cycle begins all over. You begin waiting for the next moment. This can create a dangerous cycle. But intensity and intimacy are not the same thing. Real intimacy generally creates greater understanding, greater trust, and greater stability over time. Obsession created by uncertainty produces something different: constant interpretation. You are not experiencing the relationship, you are trying to decode it. And there is another psychological layer here. Uncertainty gives the imagination enormous freedom. When you don't know who someone really is, you can project onto them. The facts tell one story, but imagination tells another. The lesson is not that you should become mysterious or deliberately ignore people. That is a superficial interpretation. The deeper lesson is to understand your own reaction to uncertainty. When someone becomes distant, ask yourself, am I attracted to this person, or am I addicted to solving the uncertainty they have created? That question can save you from wasting enormous amounts of emotional energy. You don't need to chase every unanswered question. And once uncertainty has captured your attention, something even deeper can happen. Your ego becomes involved. At this point, you are no longer simply wondering about another person. You begin wondering what their behavior says about you. This is where rejection becomes psychologically complicated. If someone ignores you, the rational response might be simple. We want to believe that we are desirable, capable, respected, and worthy of attention. When another person suddenly withdraws that attention, they can unintentionally challenge that image. And this is why you sometimes see people pursuing someone they didn't even value that much in the beginning. Before the rejection, they were indifferent. After the rejection, they become fascinated. Why? Because the goal has changed. It is no longer about connection, it is about restoring the wounded sense of self. You want the message, you want the apology, you want them to regret leaving. You want evidence that you were valuable after all. This is the ego turning a relationship into a competition. And competition can be extraordinarily seductive. Once you feel challenged, you may become willing to invest far more time and energy than the situation deserves. You may tolerate behavior you would normally reject simply because you have become determined to win. But here is the danger. If your sense of worth depends on someone else's response, you have handed them control over your emotional state. There is also a philosophical lesson here. You cannot build a stable sense of self from constantly changing external reactions. Other people are unpredictable. Their preferences change, their circumstances change, their feelings change. If your identity depends on being wanted by a particular person, your identity will always be vulnerable. The stronger position is to separate your value from their decision. This does not mean becoming arrogant or pretending rejection doesn't hurt. It means having enough self-awareness to say, needing revalue. Because the moment you no longer need someone to choose you in order to feel valuable, their ability to control you disappears. So the next time you feel an overwhelming urge to chase someone who has rejected or ignored you, pause before you act. Ask yourself one uncomfortable question. Do I genuinely want this person, or do I simply want to prove that I can make them want me? Your answer may reveal more about your psychology than their behavior ever could. This is the pattern where attention, affection, or approval appears unpredictably rather than consistently. And paradoxically, inconsistency can make people hold on more tightly. Imagine someone who is warm toward you one day and distant the next. One week they seem deeply interested, and the following week they barely respond. Then, just when you begin accepting that they are gone, they return with a message, a compliment, or a moment of affection. This is one reason uncertain patterns can become so difficult to walk away from. You are not simply enjoying the moments of attention, you are waiting for them, and waiting changes your psychology. You begin checking your phone more often, you replay conversations, you look for signs, you analyze changes in their behavior. A small gesture that would normally mean very little suddenly feels significant because it arrives after a period of absence. The danger is that you can begin confusing emotional intensity. Perhaps it is coming from This distinction is crucial. A healthy connection generally becomes more understandable with time. You learn how the other person communicates, you develop trust, their behavior becomes relatively predictable. You don't have to constantly decode whether they care. An unhealthy dynamic often moves in the opposite direction. The more involved you become, the more confused you feel. And yet you stay because occasionally something beautiful happens. That occasional reward becomes evidence that the relationship. You remember the amazing conversation, the affectionate message, the moment when they seemed completely present, and you use that moment to justify enduring everything that comes between those moments. This is where self-awareness becomes essential. Don't judge a relationship by its best moments. Study its pattern. Anyone can be charming occasionally. Anyone can be affectionate when circumstances are right. What matters is what happens consistently. And this principle extends far beyond romance. People can become trapped in friendships, workplaces, social circles, and even personal goals because of unpredictable rewards. And sometimes, maybe next time becomes a prison. So when someone repeatedly disappears and returns, don't automatically interpret their return as proof of deeper feelings. Look at the entire pattern. Ask yourself, is this relationship giving me stability, or is it keeping me addicted to anticipation? You don't have to punish anyone. You don't have to become cold. You simply need to become capable of seeing reality without allowing a few powerful moments to erase the larger pattern. Don't become addicted to the return of someone who repeatedly chooses to leave. And this brings us to a distinction that is often misunderstood. People are not necessarily attracted to coldness. They are often attracted to the independence that can exist behind it. There is a difference between someone who ignores you because they are trying to manipulate your emotions and someone who is simply not desperate for your attention. From the outside, these behaviors can look similar. But psychologically, they are completely different. The manipulator creates distance because they want a reaction. The independent person creates space because they already have a life, priorities, standards, and a sense of identity that does not depend entirely on another person's approval. That distinction matters. Think about the person who constantly needs reassurance. They need immediate replies. They become anxious when someone doesn't respond. They continually ask whether the other person still cares. Their emotional state rises and falls according to someone else's behavior. Now compare that with someone who enjoys connection but doesn't depend on it for their identity. They have work to do, relationships to maintain, interests to pursue, and standards they refuse to abandon. There is something naturally compelling about that kind of person. Why? Because independence communicates an important psychological message. I want you, but I do not need you to complete me. That is very different from pretending not to care. Fake indifference requires constant performance. You have to calculate how long to wait before replying. You deliberately withhold affection. You try to create jealousy. You monitor whether the other person is chasing you. When you are not desperately seeking validation, you become less reactive. You listen more carefully. You make decisions more calmly. You don't over-explain yourself. You don't negotiate away your boundaries simply because you are afraid someone might leave. This is where self-respect becomes more powerful than strategy. The goal should never be to learn how to ignore people so they will chase you. That approach keeps you trapped in the same psychological game. You are still allowing another person's reaction to determine your behavior. You can express affection without fearing that it makes you weak. And you can walk away when someone's behavior consistently violates your standards. That is emotional independence. And there is an important philosophical principle underneath all of this. Freedom is not the absence of relationships. Freedom is the ability to participate in relationships without losing yourself inside them. You can love someone and still maintain boundaries. You can desire someone and still maintain boundaries. It is the quiet confidence of someone who knows where they are going. So don't become colder simply because you want people to chase you. Become more complete. Build a life that doesn't collapse when someone's attention disappears. Asterisk, don't manufacture distance to become desirable. Build a life so grounded that you never need to chase attention. Asterisk, and after understanding scarcity, uncertainty, ego, intermittent reinforcement, and the difference between independence and calculated coldness, we arrive at the most important lesson of all. This sounds simple, but it is one of the hardest things for people to accept. We often measure our worth through other people's reactions. If they respond, we feel important. If they pursue us, we feel desirable. If they return after leaving, we interpret it as proof that we mattered. But what happens when they don't return? That is where your character is tested. Anyone can feel confident when they are receiving attention. The deeper form of confidence appears when attention disappears and you remain grounded. You have to learn to distinguish desire from dependency. You can want someone without needing them. Distinguish. These are not signs of weakness. They are signs that your emotional life is no longer controlled by another person's decisions. The person who continually chases is often trying to control an uncontrollable outcome. They send another message, they explain themselves again, they offer another opportunity, they try to demonstrate their value, they believe that if they just say the right thing, behave differently, or become more impressive, they can finally change the other person's mind. But there is a painful truth here. You cannot negotiate genuine desire. If someone consistently chooses distance, chasing rarely creates the kind of connection you actually want. And temporary attention is not the same as mutual respect. This is why walking away can be psychologically transformative. Walking away is not necessarily an act of punishment. It is an act of acceptance. You are accepting reality instead of arguing with it. And acceptance gives you something that pursuit cannot: clarity. Once you stop chasing, you can finally observe the situation without constantly trying to influence it. You begin to see the person's actions rather than the potential you imagined. You stop focusing on what they... Wherever your attention goes, your emotional energy follows. If you spend weeks obsessing over someone who has chosen not to reciprocate, you are allowing another person to occupy psychological space that could have been used to build your own life. Put that energy somewhere productive. Work on your craft, strengthen your friendships, develop your body and mind, pursue meaningful goals, become more capable, not to make the other person regret losing you, but because your life should never become a waiting room for someone else's decision. You can evaluate them calmly rather than desperately. You can ask, have their actions actually changed? Do they respect me now? Is there genuine reciprocity? That is power without manipulation. So the next time you find yourself chasing someone who repeatedly ignores you, stop and ask one final question. What am I sacrificing to keep pursuing someone who isn't pursuing me? Your answer may be the beginning of your freedom. Stop chasing what refuses to meet you halfway. Your dignity begins where your desperation ends.